Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we dedicate ourselves today to an exploration of the escalating turbulence in the Middle East around the attack by Israel and the United States on Iran last Saturday. You'll remember in our humanity session last Friday, I began the program by warning people that a invasion or an attack against Iran was imminent. I had no idea it was going to start the next morning, but it was clear to me, as it was clear to many observers, that the US and Israel were preparing for war. One of the indicators, at least in my mind, was the success of the negotiations taking place in Geneva between the Iranians and Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, who were President Trump's emissaries, both to the situation in Iran and also to the situation in the Ukraine. At the time, the Ukrainians and the Russians were also in Geneva, in different rooms of the hotel they were in. The negotiations with Iran, according to the Omani foreign minister who was brokering the discussion between the two sides, who apparently never met. So it was through um, um, intermediaries that the Iranians had made the Americans an offer that was so positive. They were willing to basically radically reduce, if not give up, their enrichment. They were welcoming U.S. Oil companies to drill oil in Iran, which is one of the largest oil companies in the world. And as soon as I heard that news, I knew an attack was imminent because that is exactly what they did last June during the so-called 12-day war, where they were having very successful and dynamic negotiations. And right at the height of the negotiations, when they knew or suspected that the Iranians would be lulled into a false sense of security, they launched their aerial attack on Iran. Turned out that this was prescient, and here we are, basically a week later, 7 days later, in a conflict in the Middle East that has now taken on global proportions. So it is a safe thing to say, and I say it very carefully. We are now at the beginning of World War III because the conflict that has been incited by Israel and the United States against Iran is now, as I will describe, taking on not only regional but global implications and consequences, which are escalating as we speak. The whole world, all of you, me, are involved in what's going on in Iran. And we need to understand it politically, geostrategically, and most importantly, we need to understand what's going on theologically. Because the two protagonists, the Iranians and the US Israelis, are carrying into this conflict an apocalyptic vision of the end of the world. I want everybody to just take in what I just said, that we're at the beginnings of World War III, and we are now very explicitly and consciously in a time of apocalypse. The global situation could not be more dangerous than it is right now. So let me start with a little history, and that will frame what is happening today. I'd like to start with Iran in the post-Second World War history, because even as the United States has been embroiled with Israel on these attacks against Iran in 2026, the U.S. meddling and interference and manipulation and coercion against Iran goes back to 1945 and the aftermath of the war. Remember, the final conclave of the war was in Yalta. The Iranians were at that time essentially a backwater to Europe, even Russia, certainly the United States. But they had massive oil reserves. And one of the decisions at Yalta was really the carve up of the world. Russia was given Eastern Europe. The United States was given Western Europe. The British were given the Middle East, along with France. That had been developed after the First World War, but after the Second World War, it was basically confirmed. Iran had a lot of oil. So the British, through a company called Aramco, controlled the oil. They controlled the oil wells because they were colonizers and they controlled most of the Middle East during the early part of the 20th century. They controlled production. The Iranians were not given hardly any of the profits, so they were just sitting there watching the main source of profitability and revenue be taken by the British and sold on the global market after, of course, satiating what the British needed for their own concerns. In 1953, there was a man named Mossadegh who was urbane. He was very sophisticated, knew multiple languages, dedicated to democracy, who had been elected, and his policy formation was to nationalize the oil. He told the British that they could have companies there, but the Iranians needed to own their own oil since they were a sovereign state, and they would lease the oil to the British. But the British couldn't just control everything. And the British said no. The British called the American president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and they made the decision to overthrow Mossadegh. and bring in the Shah. So the CIA and MI6 dutifully manipulated the Iranian political situation through briberies and false flag operations to create chaos and disturbance. Mossadegh was overthrown, eventually killed. The Shah was brought in, who was a military man. And the Shah brought in an era of Western domination, Western orientation, friendship with Israel, and modernization, reinforced by a secret police called SAVAK that coordinated with the CIA and the MI6 and Mossad in Israel to implement a very repressive regime. So on the one hand, you had Westernization, and on the other hand, you had systemic repression of the Iranian people. There was a cleric, an imam, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who at that time had been exiled because he was a ferocious opponent of the Shah, a ferocious opponent of Westernization and secularization. He was a devout Shiite Muslim. And he began to send tapes, little cassette tapes, from his home outside of Paris back into Iran. And many of you who were paying attention to the news those days will recall that before long, there were first tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and then millions of people on the streets all over Iran. And it became impossible for the Shah, even with SAVAK, even with the CIA, to counter the growing momentum of popular revolt. This is what totalitarian regimes are the most afraid of. The people, organized en masse. And so in 1979, the Shah fled and was given asylum eventually in the United States. And but before he left, Jimmy Carter, Richard Nixon, and senators and diplomats from Europe all went to Iran and really believed that Iran was in the Western camp in perpetuity. And then came the Iranian Revolution under the guidance of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And Iran was transformed very quickly into another repressive regime. The best way to understand it, if you're an American, is to consider what will happen if the United States, as Donald Trump and most of his cabinet want to do, create a Christian nationalist state with ICE agents enforcing religious law in the United States on a people that are basically secular and basically modernistic. That's what happened to Iran. When he died on his deathbed, the Ayatollah Khomeini signed 700 death sentences to be carried out after he was dead for enemies of the regime and people that were considered to be agents of the CIA or Mossad or whatever. You'll remember that young Iranian Revolutionary Guard activists stormed the American embassy apparently without the Ayatollah's approval. They just sort of did it. And the next thing the world knew, Jimmy Carter was facing off against the Iranians with the entire American embassy taken hostage in its own embassy. And there was secret negotiations with Ronald Reagan, who was candidate trying to defeat Jimmy Carter. And it was the hostage situation unresolved because Carter couldn't resolve it because Reagan had gone behind his back and made certain promises to the Iranian regime. So that it was actually, if you remember your history, it was on Inauguration Day, January 20th, 1981, that the hostages were all released. And Jimmy Carter left in disgrace. And then what the United States proceeded to do was go to Saddam Hussein, who was the leader in Iraq, and convince Saddam Hussein to invade Iran with the full support of America and Europe, complete with Scud missiles, which were sort of the drones of that day, and chemical warfare. The United States gave Saddam Hussein chemical warfare capacities. And over the next 8 years, war was waged against Iran. Cities were bombed. Tens and hundreds of thousands of people were killed and wounded. But the Iranian regime prevailed. And it's worth noting that Al-Khamenei, the Ayatollah that was just killed last Saturday in his home with family around him, was a volunteer during the Iraq-Iran war. He was on the front lines, and one of the reasons why he was designated as the Ayatollah after the Ayatollah Khomeini died in 1989 was because of his courage and his bravery during that war, just volunteering to go to the front lines. Such was his commitment to preserving the Islamic Revolution. At the same time, Iran began to articulate a foreign policy formation that actively criticized the United States as what the Ayatollah called the Great Satan. U.S. imperialism was condemned. U.S. support for Israel was condemned. Zionism was condemned. The Palestinian people, the freedom fighters in Lebanon, the Hezbollah, others, the Houthi in Yemen, were brought into an alliance with Iran, which was simultaneously repressing freedom internally and fomenting active resistance against the United States and Israel externally. And it's really important for everyone to understand this history because for the last 47 years, the United States and Israel and Europe have been doing everything they can to topple the mullahs, the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they have not been able to prevail. So what's really taking place is a classic, what Jung would call an antinomy. two mutually exclusive but internally consistent truths. Remember what Jung said, the opposite of a truth is almost never a falsehood. It's always another great truth that appears to be in contradiction. But if you look deeply enough, it's in coherence, it's in complementarity. So between the mullahs in Iran and the US-Israel axis dominating the Western Mediterranean in Israel, you've had this dialectic for nearly 50 years. But it's important to bear in mind as we begin this discussion that it was the United States that is responsible for the Ayatollah, because it was the United States and Britain that overthrew the democratically elected Mossadegh regime in 1953, brought in the Shah, supported the Shah's repression, which ignited this counter movement that brought in the Ayatollahs, that then defeated the Iraqis that the Americans set up as a proxy, and has now been taking on Israel and the United States, supporting the axis of resistance ever since. And this is why Benjamin Netanyahu, for the last 40 years, who's a very smart guy, has said that in the end, Iran is the one country that, if taken out, would give Israel and the United States complete dominance over the Middle East. You'll recall from previous programs that General Wesley Clark tells the story that I've repeated several times, but it's worth bringing in, that after 9/11, he went to the Pentagon and was shown a piece of paper that said that there were, 7 countries that they were going to now take out in the next 5 years: Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, Sudan, Somalia, and Iran. And this was the master plan of Netanyahu. Because what Netanyahu understood 40 years ago as a Zionist dedicated to the expansion of Israel, Eretz Israel, which I'll refer to in more detail later, but essentially is the creation of an Israeli state that is not just dedicated to the genocide in Gaza and the elimination of the Palestinians from Palestine, as we all know, but is committed strategically to taking over southern Syria, southern Lebanon, parts of Jordan, and parts of Egypt, possibly parts of Turkey. This came up in Tucker Carlson's interview with the U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee just 2 weeks ago, where Tucker said, well, in the book of Genesis, it says that God said to Abraham, you're going to have all the land between the Euphrates, which is in Iraq, and the Nile. And the U.S. ambassador to Israel said, yes, that's all fine with me if they take it all. When I was at the University of Tel Aviv in 1972 and 73, for my junior year abroad, I was in classes where they put up maps of exactly what I just described, where what we now think of as Israel, this small, thin little state with the West Bank, that was just the beginning. They showed us maps of everything that I've described. Eretz Israel. God gave us all of it. And that's what Netanyahu has been preparing for strategically. And that's why the Middle East is in complete chaos. It's in chaos in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Somalia, in Sudan, by design. Because the more chaos, the easier it is for Israel to expand. It's already in Syria on the outskirts of Damascus. It's ordered mass evacuations in southern Lebanon. They're not going in to just fight for a while and leave. They're going in to stay because they believe that not only did God give them Palestine, God gave them all the land between the Euphrates and the Nile. Look on the map and you'll see the kind of turbulence required for Israel and the United States to seize that land. And there is one country that stands against it with enough capacity, 93 million people. Iran is bigger than all of Western Europe. It's the fifth largest country in the world. It's the fourth or fifth largest oil producer. It's a civilizational state, meaning the Persian civilization, one of the oldest civilizations in recorded history. Iran stands against everything that Israel wants to achieve. So Netanyahu has been working in the last, I think, year. He's made 7 trips to Washington and has mobilized everything he can to get the president of the United States to do what Trump did last Saturday. And that is to declare regime change in Iran is the strategic goal of this war. And whatever you've heard from Secretary of State Marco Rubio or Secretary of War Pete Hegseth about, well, the Israelis did it, and then we thought we would have to do it because they may strike us first, that's all chaff. There's one goal here, and that's the overthrow of the Iranian state. And if you talk to Israeli intelligence, they wanted to do with Iran what they were seeking to do with Russia. And that is break Iran up. You give some to the Kurds, some to the Azeris, some to the Persians, some to this ethnic group, and you just break it up. And in that chaos and confusion, Israel can seize the land. So strategically, that's as simply as I can put what is at stake between the United States and Israel and Iran and the axis of resistance. Now, let's turn to the war. Two things happened last Saturday. One, as I mentioned, Khamenei was killed in his home. I think it was with his daughter-in-law and several of his grandchildren, other family members. He had been meeting with senior leaders in the IRGC and military and the government. The head of the IRGC was killed. Apparently, I think they said 78 people were killed instantly. And they also, in a town in southern Iran, blew up a school of young girls. I think 165 young girls and their teachers. It was a primary school. Almost all of them were under 10 years old. Other homes were bombed. As a decapitation strike at one level against the leadership and mass slaughter on the other. That's the MO of Israel. That's what Israel does, is engage in mass slaughter. You see it in Palestine, you see it in the West Bank. You're watching it even if you look at the news today in Beirut. It's mass slaughter of civilians, assassinations of anyone perceived to be a leader, in complete violation of international law. The Israelis and the Americans thought it was going to be a quick decapitation strike. And the initial expectations, this will take a few days, but there is no way that the Iranian state could sustain the decapitations of al-Khamenei and the head of the IRGC and a demonstration that we can blow everybody to smithereens. There were calls for popular revolt. Nothing happened. And the next thing everybody knew is not only were the Iranians still intact, but they launched a barrage of drone and missile attacks against U.S. installations in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, the UAE generally, and of course against Israel with devastating effect. And they shut down the Gulf of Hormuz, which is the choke point right there at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. It's only about 30 kilometers, about 20 miles wide. And 20% of all the world's oil goes in and out of the Gulf of Hormuz. And all of a sudden, the world woke up to the reality that not only were the Iranians ready, but they had escalated the war way beyond what they did in last June, which was basically attacks specifically on Israel. That's what the U.S. and Israeli leadership thought was going to happen. They had reinforced the Iron Dome in Israel. They thought they could decapitate the state like they tried to do in June. They try to do last December and early January, and now they're trying it again in March. This decapitation, incitement of mass protest, regime change. Now, this is where it gets global. So pay attention. World War III. What happens when 20% of the world's oil supply is shut down in one day? What happens when in Qatar, which supplies 25% of the world's liquid national gas, stops production? Refineries are shut down. U.S. intelligence, U.S. bases are blown up. The reverberations of that go global. And that's what I want to start dwelling on, because we're all in it, my friends. Whatever you think of Iran, whatever you think of the U.S. and Israel, we're all in on this one now. What do the oil producing countries do when they can't ship oil? Well, they have holding tanks, but the holding tanks are temporary and don't hold very much oil because they're expecting to ship it. So the longer this goes on, even if you're the Saudi Arabians, you've got to start thinking about shutting down your oil production. And that wreaks havoc on the machines, on the processing facilities, because it's a lot easier to shut down than to crank back up. With the shipping closure, most of the food in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia and so forth comes from the ships and from air cargo planes. And the entire airspace over basically the Middle East has been shut down along with shipping. So it means there's no electronics going in and out. There's no oil. There's no liquid natural gas going in and out. What do the Qataris and the Bahrainians do for food? China is dependent on Iranian oil. Not by very much, but that was part of the arrangement between China and Iran. Where do they get oil? India is dependent on Middle Eastern oil. So they're now going to Russia. Well, Russia's under sanction, and Trump had declared secondary sanctions so that any country that buys oil from Russia is sanctioned. So the domino effect in terms of what's now taking place has only begun. And what is most concerning is that while a week ago they were saying, yeah, a couple days and we're done. Then a couple days ago they said, well, this could last a couple weeks. Yesterday, the Pentagon said this war could last till September. Just imagine where the US economy and the European economy and the world economy is going to be enduring a ripple effect of economic deprivation, standstill in world trade, and a constantly escalating military situation between the Iranians and the Israelis and the Americans. Now, let me make a few military points, and then I would like to turn to the theology of the apocalypse. Pete Hegseth and the US President Donald Trump are talking about, man, we can cream these guys. Wait till our B-52s and our B-29s, and Israel is mass bombing Iran, and there's no way that they can withstand. And the media is showing pictures, and you note that there's no pictures hardly at all, except on alternative media, of any of the damage being done to Israel. It's all the damage being done to Iran. But Israel is sustaining significant damage right now. And in fact, to recall a little history, in the June 6th war last year, it was Netanyahu on day 10 that called Washington and said, we can't take it anymore. They're destroying everything. And that's when Trump intervened and stopped the war. How long is Israel going to be able to withstand the Iranian attacks? But we're in this media illusion that blanket bombing can exact regime change. It's never occurred in the 100 years that we've used airplanes for war, whether it was over Germany. Remember, at a certain point, Germany had no anti-aircraft. We bombed the living daylights out of Germany. And ironically, German production increased and the people became even more resistant. Remember Kosovo, where for 69 days, the United States and NATO bombed the living daylights out of Serbia. The Serbs didn't quit. It wasn't until the Russians intervened at the direct request of the president, Clinton, that the Serbians withdrew from Kosovo. But the bombing from the air didn't do it. The Israelis have had complete dominance of the air over Gaza. They've bombed Gaza to smithereens. Hamas still stands. There are more people in Hamas now than before October 7th. The Palestinian people have been obliterated, and they still stand. That's very important in understanding the Iranians. You're dealing with one of the oldest civilizations in history. You're dealing with a people that have dealt with the British, with the Americans, with the Russians, with the Romans, with the Mongols, empire, conquest, and endured. So for anyone to think that this is going to be a cakewalk, it's not going to happen. The capacity of any people, whether they're the Houthis in Yemen, the Palestinians, or the Iranians, or the Serbs, to withstand air attack has been demonstrated by over 100 years of history. And believe me, greater leaders than Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu have tried to blow people to smithereens from the air, thinking that that translates into something political as a surrender. It doesn't happen. What is required, if you're going to actually do it, is boots on the ground, which is what the Israelis and the Americans are already talking about. Although it's of interest to hear that the political leadership, when it talks about boots on the ground, is very, very tentative, because they know if you're going to put boots on the ground to take over a country like Iran, the United States and Israel would have to deploy hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of soldiers. Remember when the Germans went into Poland in September 1, 1939, they had 2 million troops. It's not so easy to conquer a nation. Look at Vietnam. Look at Afghanistan. Look at Iraq. The U.S. has tried, and the U.S. has failed every time. Because there's far more that goes into the fog of war than hardware. And that leads me to the real issue. And that is the apocalyptic visions that are motivating both sides. And this is what makes what's happening in Iran really scary. We're not dealing with just war. We're dealing with apocalypse. Starting with the Iranians. The Iranians are Shia Muslims, Shiites. Most of the Muslims are Sunni. And it's a very long, complicated story. I'll just give you the headlines. But when the Prophet Muhammad passed in the middle of the 7th century, the 640s, he had a nephew named Ali. And there was a debate. Some people felt that Ali, as a relative of the Prophet, should take the spiritual leadership. And there were others that said, no, this should be decided by a council and like the election of a pope. So Ali and his son had certain powers, and the Ummah, as it was called, had certain powers, and there was conflict. Ali was assassinated, his son, and it gave rise to this lineage of imams that were in a dialectic against the Sunni, the Caliphate, initially in Saudi Arabia and then in Damascus and then in Baghdad. With the death of the 11th Imam, there was this mythology that grew up that the 12th Imam was going to come at the end of time and set things aright in an apocalyptic spasm of both violence and redemption. So the Shia have been living in a messianic expectation of the 12th Imam for about 600 years, 700 years. Because Ali was assassinated and his son, there's also embedded in the Shia mentality and culture and theology and spirituality the archetype of the martyr, dying for the cause. This is what Khamenei just did. He was explicit. His aide said, "You need to be in a bunker, man. The Israelis are going to take you out." He said, "No." Was he 89 years old or however old he was? He says, I'm a man of the people. I'm gonna just stay working where I am, where they know I am, till the end, because he knew that if he was martyred, the blood of the martyrs would inspire the people for deeper resistance. And that's exactly what's happened. It goes back to the law of unintended consequences, folks. No matter who you are and how big you are, you take an act, and often the opposite of what you intend is actually what takes place. That causes a ricochet of other consequences and reverberations, that creates a future nobody could imagine, even if you're a Caesar, the most powerful man in the world. On the Judeo-Christian side, you have apocalypticism of the same kind, but different details. And in fact, many of you have probably seen in the news reports that U.S. military commanders are telling their troops that Trump is God's servant to bring down Armageddon. Because when Armageddon happens, Jesus comes again, just like the 12th Imam. Same structure, different details. I know about this personally. I'm the son of a missionary. And when I was a little boy, I was told categorically that the Bible says that when the Jews returned to Israel in 1948, that was the beginning of the end of time. And what they called the rapture, the return of Jesus. And there was going to be an antichrist that would rise up out of the land of Gog and Magog, all foretold in the book of Revelation. And he would wear the mark of the beast. And people were given the mark of the beast. And that Israel would be attacked. And right at the darkest hour, Jesus was going to break through and go through the beautiful gate in Jerusalem, which is currently sealed, by the way, and reign for 1,000 years, bringing peace and harmony to the world. I was raised on that. And I knew from a very early age it was completely delusional. But I watched how fervently my parents interpreted world events in relationship to the apocalypse. So I grew up in a conservative Protestant Christian tradition where the worse things got socially or geostrategically, they would say, well, this means that Jesus is coming again very soon. And they were always living in what is called theologically eschatological expectation. They're waiting for the eschaton. They're waiting for the apocalypse when all will be revealed and Jesus comes again. And the Christians are snatched up in a twinkling of an eye, and the rest of us are left to our perdition. Mike Huckabee is a Christian fundamentalist. Pete Hegseth is a Christian fundamentalist. Many of the people around Donald Trump are Christian fundamentalists, Christian nationalists. And the alliance between the evangelical Christians and Israel is based on this extraordinarily powerful messianic expectation that Israel going back and creating the return and the establishment of the state of Israel is the triggering mechanism for the end of the world and Jesus coming back and we all get to go to heaven. They believe that just as firmly as most of us believe that the earth is round, or that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. They actually believe it as if it's completely true because the Bible says so. So when you look at what's going on in Iran, not only are we in the fog of war and nobody knows what's going to happen, and there's many layers to what's taking place, but at the broadest contextual level, this is a war between titanic spiritual traditions who are willing to be martyred for their cause on the one hand and think that they're going to go to heaven with Jesus as soon as it gets bad enough to warrant his return. That's what's being played out. And that's why when you hear Pete Hegseth talk about it, you can feel his fervor. No mercy, no prisoners, kill them all. We don't even want a fair fight. Hit them while they're down. They're going in for the kill, everybody. They're going in for regime change. Now, let me conclude with a geostrategic note. As it all has turned out, Iran is the anvil upon which the geostrategic struggle between the collective West and Israel and the emerging coalition of the BRICS countries, Russia, China, South Africa, India, Brazil, and 100 other countries, basically the global majority, is being played out. If the United States and Israel defeat Iran and engage in whatever regime change is going to happen, that blows a major hole right in the middle of the BRICS coalition. Because you have Russia, you have China, you have India, you have Saudi Arabia, and you got Iran right in the middle. So whoever controls Iran controls the central pivot for Asia. Donald Trump understands that. Vladimir Putin understands that. Xi Jinping understands that. So do the Iranians, and so do the Israelis. And this is why this is going to be a fight to the death. This is far more consequential than Ukraine. Ukraine is in Europe. There's some territorial issues between Ukraine and Russia that are going to be resolved probably within the next 12 months because Russia is on the verge of victory and Ukraine is on the verge of collapse. But once Russia takes what it's going to take in Ukraine, the world will continue on. Not much changed. What's going to happen in Iran is going to change everything. If Iran wins and Israel and the United States are defeated because they can't take Iran out, there is a good possibility that within a few years, the United States will withdraw completely from the Middle East, like it's withdrawn from Europe, because it won't have the capacity to continue to wage war with the Israelis. And the Israelis know that. That's why Netanyahu has traveled to Washington 7 times in the last year to make sure that Trump does what he's told. If the US and Israel wins, BRICS suffers a potentially mortal wound. So we're battling, my friends, over quite literally the fate of the earth, socially, politically, geostrategically, over what's going to take place and unfold over the next couple of weeks and possibly a couple of months in Iran. Which brings me to my final point. Epstein. The word is that the reason why Trump caved to Netanyahu, apparently against his better judgment, is because the videos in the Epstein file show Trump molesting 12 and 13-year-old girls and engaging in what can only be described as very lewd behavior. And Netanyahu has the tape. That's what's being reported. And if you look back over the last year or so, every time Epstein starts to surface, Trump does something to divert attention because he knows what's in those tapes. He's mentioned in the record, apparently, according to reports, over 1 million times. That's a lot of times for Donald Trump to be in a sex ring with stories circulating of extraordinary pornographic episodes in which he is on film. So when we think about what's going on, we need to pray that somehow, in a way that we cannot now foresee because of the complexities and the interrelationships between the layers, both personal, religious, strategic, and moral, how all these layers interpenetrate and play out. I urge all of you to watch the news, particularly the alternative news, so that you get as closely proximate what's going on as you possibly can. I pray for the Iranian people as I pray for the people of Ukraine who are being destroyed because of the carnage between the two superpowers, battling for an advantage that doesn't amount to a hill of beans in the overall scheme of things. What I fear about Iran, which is not present in Ukraine, is the messianic apocalyptic visions held on both sides that are motivating people toward total destruction as the fulfillment of a theological prophetic fantasy. So how we navigate through these next several weeks and months is going to be quite something. And I am grateful beyond words for the Humanity Rising community. I thank all of you for who you are and what you're doing. I urge you to take this video and send it out to everyone you know, because it's so important for people to get a bigger vision, a bigger perspective, a broader context about what's happening. Because if you understand the context, you know where you are. It's when you're confused and you don't know how to connect the dots that you become susceptible to the manipulations of propaganda and mind control by vested and special interests. So I've shared what I know. I've shared in the spirit of truth pursued, not truth possessed. I urge you all to just think about it. You may agree, you may disagree. This is just what I think is happening that I'm sharing with you as my friends. So thank you, everyone. I will join the after chat for a little bit if you want to have a deeper conversation. I thank you all once again, and we'll see you again next week for our next session of Humanity Rising. If you want to join the after chat, you can get the link in the chat box, and it was in your Zoom reminder for today. Thank you, everyone. I love you so much. I love you all. Bye for now.